Welcome back to Velshi on MSNBC. I'm Charles Coleman Jr. filling in for Ali today. Now, since returning to office, Donald Trump has dismantled decades-old agencies and initiatives which were initially designed to protect Black Americans and other marginalized communities. He has justified these actions by claiming he's rooting out racial discrimination disguised as diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as Pulitzer-Prize winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones points out in a new essay for the New York Times Magazine, in just months, Trump has managed to upend 6 decades of civil rights progress. And here's how. He's effectively dismantled the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. This is the very agency created to enforce the Civil Rights Act and to prevent discrimination in employment tied to federal dollars. He's also gutted the funding and staff needed to investigate and fight housing discrimination. He shuttered the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, which addressed the fact that Black communities are disproportionately exposed to toxic pollutants, pesticides, and waste. He's also closed the Department of Veteran Affairs Equity Office. Now, that office was dedicated to addressing the racial disparities in how disabled veterans receive compensation. He shut down regional civil rights offices that were key to fighting discrimination in schools and to enforcing desegregation. And he's even forced schools to eliminate initiatives that diversify teacher pipelines and support Black students to help close the achievement gap. And that's just some of what he's done as part of an sweeping effort to dismantle every program, every office, law, or mandate designed to protect the civil rights of Black Americans and other marginalized communities. These are protections that are still very much so desperately needed as the data continues to show that Black Americans suffer disproportionate discrimination across every sector of American life. Perhaps most disturbingly, he's now using the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to enforce executive orders dismantling diversity programs. Nikole Hannah-Jones put it plainly, quote, by deploying the Civil Rights Act against the very people it was created to protect, conservatives hope to get as close to their ultimate goal as possible, repealing it. Joining me now is Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's a Pulitzer-Prize winning reporter, the New York Times Magazine creator of the 1619 Project, and the founder of the Center for Journalism and Democracy at the Howard University, which is probably the most important thing on her resume. Nikole, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I read the piece. Phenomenal historical account of the progression of both civil rights in America and their dismantling. One of the central themes that I think is really important that you talk about, I'd love to expand on, is the notion that regardless of what's codified, if you don't have these agencies and institutions that are intended to enforce the laws that are on the books, it leaves our rights as Black people subject to erasure.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on to discuss this piece. And that is really a key theme of the essay. We understand that laws need enforcement when it comes to almost everything except civil rights. We understand that just because you outlaw murder doesn't mean you don't need a police department. It doesn't mean that you don't need an entire system of justice to enforce the laws and make sure that people follow them. Yet when it comes to civil rights, we kind of believe that they're self-enforcing, that just the very existence of those laws are enough to make people end discrimination and for us all to have equality. Of course, that's never been true. So what Trump is doing in his administration is basically, he doesn't have the ability to overturn the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act or the Fair Housing Act, but he can gut the entire enforcement mechanism and send the message that if you discriminate, there's no one in federal government that is actually going to enforce the law. So what I tried to show in this piece is we have been here before in America. You know, the entire civil rights movement was fought to really vindicate rights that Black people had already won following the end of slavery. The civil rights acts that were passed in the 1860s, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. These were laws that had already been passed, and yet they existed on paper. And when you had a federal government and state governments that wouldn't enforce them, it's as if those laws did not exist, and Black people were certainly not protected by them. And so this is the fear, is that we're entering another era like that.
You know, Nikole, in your connection to history, the way that you just did, another theme that I noticed when I read the piece was this conversation about how disinformation and distortion of a narrative actually shapes opinions around the necessity for civil rights and how at the turn of Reconstruction, there was an effort by school teachers and textbooks to essentially whitewash history in such a way that made people think differently about the first black Republicans that were elected to the Senate following Reconstruction, following slavery, and how that shaped things, and how now there's also a similar disinformation campaign that has made it seemingly more okay for folks to be not as outraged that civil rights are being erased just 5 years after America's racial reckoning in 2020. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So we know that these efforts to rewrite history, these disinformation campaigns, they go hand in hand. They erase the history first, and that allows them then to erase your rights. And so I talk about this organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy that rises up after the end of the Civil War. I liken them to, the post-Reconstruction era version of the Moms for Liberty that we see today, which is this group of white women who decide that they want to rewrite the narrative around the white South and why we ever had a civil war in the first place. And so they begin to take control and try to urge the changing of curriculum. They're writing textbooks, and they are basically legitimizing Jim Crow because they are writing a story, a narrative of the South that Black people were incapable of self-governance, that Black people were getting jobs and getting positions that they didn't deserve, that may sound familiar to the times that we're in, and that Black people were not the rightful participants in democracy. So you have these narratives that are being put out in textbooks, that are being placed, all of the Confederate monuments that we saw, those don't begin until after the fall of Reconstruction. They don't happen right after slavery. And that's creating a narrative that allows the stripping of Black people's rights. So I think we're seeing a similar effort here, these efforts to really downplay the history of racism, to downplay Black accomplishments. The federal government, the Donald Trump administration, we've paid a lot of attention to the way that they have been working to erase the accomplishments of Black people. We haven't paid as much attention to the way that they're actually eradicating the enforcement mechanisms for our civil rights. I think that is just as critical. And the last point I want to quickly make, we keep labeling this DEI. That's because the Trump administration is saying that what he's doing is challenging DEI. Well, first of all, no court has ever said DEI is illegal or discriminatory, but also they're not actually tackling DEI alone. They're actually dismantling the ability to integrate our organizations to try to bring about equality and the enforcement of civil rights.
Always something that I think about, which is paying as much attention to the equality of outcomes as we have tried to the equality of opportunity. So much I could talk to you about this, but thank you for your time this morning, Nikole. That is esteemed journalist and Howard University professor, Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Nikole Hannah-Jones was on, she was on MSNBC a few weeks ago, interviewed by Charles Coleman. And Attorney Charles Coleman Jr. And she was talking about how Donald Trump has upended 60 years of civil rights progress. Donald Trump has upended 60 years of civil rights progress in 2 months. So she wrote a essay for the New York Times. It's an extensive essay. I printed it out. It's 14 pages. And I'm going to go to that. How Trump upended 60 years of civil rights in 2 months. And this deals with the consequences of elections. This deals with a lot of what I was talking about before the November 5th, 2024 election, warning people about Project 2025. Warning people about Agenda 47, which is the Agenda 47 was Donald Trump's agenda, which mirrors Project 2025. Project 2025 basically tells you how to implement Agenda 47. How Trump upended 60 years of civil rights in 2 months. An assault on federal protections may bring about a new era of unchecked discrimination. This is by Nikole Hannah-Jones. She talks about how last year a little-known office in the U.S. Department of Labor helped Black workers at a Texas medical center recover $900,000 in back wages. Recover $900,000 in back wages. And Black workers at a Caterpillar plant in Illinois recover $800,000 each time over allegations that applicants lost out on jobs because of their race. It was called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. This division investigates and fights employment discrimination for 1/5 of the U.S. labor force. It was created in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order strengthening the provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned racial discrimination by employers. Okay, so this goes back to Lyndon Johnson. Now, remember, Trump's second day back in office, he rescinded Executive Order 11246, which is affirmative action. That dealt with affirmative action in federal government contracts. Okay. Now, what Nikole Hannah-Jones here is talking about is the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. All right. And this division investigates and fights employment discrimination for 1/5 of the U.S. labor force. It was created in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order strengthening the provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned racial discrimination by employers. Okay, so the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs specifically enforced the law among businesses and institutions that contracted with the government or received federal funds. Okay, that's affirmative action. The landmark law also banned segregation and discrimination in all public places, including schools, libraries, restaurants, and buses. For more than 60 years, the executive order helped many thousands of workers who had endured discrimination. Yet, despite the law, research shows that African Americans continue to face pervasive employment discrimination at a rate that has not declined since the late 1980s. On his second day in office, Donald Trump labeled the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs efforts to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act illegal and discriminatory, presumably against white people. Donald Trump labeled this illegal and discriminatory, presumably against white people. So one of the themes of Donald Trump's campaign in 2024 was white grievance, and that white people were the main people harmed by racism. And he was dealing with white people's grievances. And when you read Project 2025, you see this theme with the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the attack on affirmative action. And they were saying that white people, they're talking about reverse racism, and they're saying that white people were the ones being harmed by all these programs. And Project 2025 was a direct backlash to the racial reckoning that took place in this country after the killing of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. And since Trump has been in office this 6 months, you've seen a total reversal of all these programs and initiatives from the past 4 years, but he's wiped out a lot of the progress that we've made over the past 60 years, if you've been paying attention to what's going on. Now, if you haven't been paying attention and you've been watching reality TV shows and just been stuck underneath a rock, then you're not going to understand any of this. Okay, I want to go to this clip here. So read the rest of this article because it is deep. Okay. Let me share a little bit more with you, and then I'm going to go to this clip of her, Nikole Hannah-Jones on MSNBC, breaking this down. Donald Trump signed his own executive order revoking President Johnson's executive order on behalf of, as he put it, quote, hardworking Americans who deserve a shot at the American dream, end quote. Now, this is the day after, remember when Donald Trump was inaugurated, he said that they were going to fulfill Dr. King's dream, have a colorblind society. He had this brain damaged Negro preacher from Detroit to recite Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, and none of those people actually understand the speech, because the speech was about dismantling white supremacy and racism. Because in the speech, Dr. King talks about fighting against police brutality. He talks about 100 years prior, in 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans being given a promissory note. And when we took that promissory note to the bank to deposit it, is marked insufficient funds. He talks about voter suppression, housing segregation, all these things. He's talking about dismantling white supremacy and racism. The beloved community, when Mahalia Jackson screams out, tell them about the dream, Martin, and he shifts and starts talking about the dream, that's about the beloved community. That's what happens after you have dismantled white supremacy and racism. So a lot of people want to talk about the dream, but they don't want to talk about Dr. King calling out white supremacy and racism and calling for the dismantling of it. See, a lot of people want to pimp Dr. King and think if we just talk about everybody getting along and everybody loving each other and black and white children holding hands, somehow you have achieved the beloved community. No, you haven't dismantled white supremacy and racism yet. And with this Trump administration in place, they don't even want to admit that racism exists, because they said we're going to have a colorblind society. So all the programs that were designed to level the playing field and repair some of the damage of historic racism, they're wiping all that out and say we want a colorblind society. Everything's equal. We're going to wipe all this stuff out. This is what they've been doing the past 6 months. Now, I want the reparations people who said, now pay close attention. The reparations people who said, we're not going to vote unless we get reparations. We ain't going to vote for Biden. We ain't going to vote for Biden. We ain't going to vote for Kamala unless we get reparations. Now, what are you getting from Trump? Because Trump said he's going to unleash the police on your ass. And Trump said he campaigned on giving police 100% immunity from criminal prosecution. Now, how you going to get reparations from Trump? How you going to get reparations from a Congress controlled by Republicans? They don't even want to acknowledge that the harm exists, let alone do something about it. If they're going to take away Medicaid from 11.8 million people, if they're going to take away Medicaid from poor white people in rural Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana that voted for them, now explain to me how you get reparations from them. Within the week, Trump's acting Secretary of Labor ordered the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs to, quote, immediately cease and desist all investigative and enforcement activity, end quote, and close all open cases. A few weeks later, the OFCCP's acting director proposed slashing its staff by 90%. Now, the attack from Doge on cutting the federal government, gutting the federal government of employees, 2.3 million federal employees, gutting it, 19% of the federal employees are African American. So when you talk about gutting the federal workforce, you're talking about defunding Black America. You're talking about negatively impacting us financially and our health care through our jobs. We're paying for homes, paying for mortgages. We're paying for children in college. It was Trump's 6-3 conservative Supreme Court that struck down Joe Biden's executive order on student loan forgiveness. And African Americans disproportionately carry student loan debt. That would have greatly helped many of us. In fewer than 2 months, 6 decades of civil rights enforcement was essentially dead. In fewer than 2 months, 6 decades of civil rights enforcement was essentially dead. Trump has justified these actions by claiming he is rooting out racial discrimination disguised as, quote, wait for it, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What they are doing, this is laid out in Project 2025. What they are doing is using what they call diversity, equity, inclusion in any programs that were remotely beneficial for African Americans. They're saying that we're rooting out discrimination and racism by wiping out these programs that were helping African Americans. And they're calling that DEI, and DEI is wrong. And we want a merit-based society. We want a meritocracy. So we're going to fulfill Dr. King's dreams. We're going to wipe out all these goddamn programs that were remotely helping Black people. And most of Black MAGA is silent while all this is being done. Trump has justified these actions by claiming he is rooting out racial discrimination disguised as diversity, equity, inclusion. Indeed, the other federal agency charged with investigating employment discrimination, the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, recently created a page on its website dedicated to helping white Americans file complaints based on being victimized by diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Now, all this was laid out in Project 2025. Now, I was talking about Project 2020. I've been talking about Project 2025 since 2023 because it came out April 2023 from the Heritage Foundation. They put out a 922-page playbook telling you what they were going to do. And people, many of our people still just walking around clueless, dumbfounded. Like, you notice everybody has a smartphone and many of them are dumber than ever. Everybody has a smartphone. There's a Google machine on your smartphone. You know, the smartphone is probably the most powerful invention in the last 40 years. Yeah, the laptop computer going from mainframes to desktops to laptops, but you have all this access to knowledge in the palm of your hand. Not only that, did you know that for instance, with Google Chrome and with Microsoft Edge, did you know they have a feature in the browser where they will read the article to you? Now, New York Times and Washington Post, they have that feature if you subscribe to them, because I have digital subscriptions to all of them. I have digital subscriptions to New York Times, Washington Post, right? So sometimes when I'm at work, I'm listening to articles because they have the feature, you press the button and it reads the article to you. But if you look here, okay, so this is, all right, so I just pulled up an article right here, okay. Montgomery Civil Rights Era newspaper honored with historical marker. This is from WSFA Channel 12. Okay, so up here, like Google Chrome, you got the 3 vertical dots up here, upper right-hand corner. You click on that, okay, and then this menu drops down, right? And then you look at that option right there. Listen to the page. Listen to this page. You click on listen to this page, and
published by WSFA. Montgomery, Allah. WSFA, a Montgomery-based civil rights era newspaper, has received a historical marker honoring its coverage of historical events.
It will read the article to you.
Ellen Lake wrote for Harvard
And
University's newspaper while pursuing her education.
You can put it in hibernation mode.
Lake noticed that there was
It'll read the article to you.
And a lack of coverage of civil rights issues in mainstream
This is
media.
Google Chrome. So we got all of this access to knowledge, and people just walking around dumbfounded. I don't understand. I'm sorry. I don't understand it. Not only that, they're paying a cell phone bill each month and just walking around just a head full of mush.
This seems like a fragment.
It makes no sense to me. I don't understand things like that. You know, I admit I consume more news. I do more reading on a daily basis than the average person. I monitor about 35 different news sources on a daily basis. I do understand it, but damn, it's like, come on. All right, so but to see what Trump is doing as simply eliminating so-called DEI is to misunderstand the scale and the consequences. What's at stake is not only corporate diversity trainings, equity offices, and the use of pronouns and email signatures. Many diversity, equity, and inclusion programs were put in place to help ensure compliance with civil rights laws and to foster integration in a society that for most of its history explicitly discriminated against Black Americans, African Americans. No court has deemed these programs illegal. See, this is what is so insidious. And Donald Trump is a dictator. He's a thug, rotten to the core, no morals. Okay. Dictator, hung out with a pedophile, Jeffrey Epstein. I don't know how many pedophiles he hung out with, but he hung out with at least one. Jeffrey Epstein, well, Ghislaine Maxwell too. So that makes 2. Okay. No court has ruled that diversity, equity, and inclusion is illegal. Donald Trump claims that it is. So his executive orders, and he did 145 executive orders in the first 100 days. Not all of them dealt with DEI, but what they're doing is they're saying DEI is illegal. They're investigating universities using diversity, equity, and inclusion as the pretext. And they're saying DEI is illegal. No court has ruled that DEI is illegal. No court has deemed these programs illegal. Yet in the opening months of his second term, Trump has capitalized on the unpopularity of equality efforts among some Americans, glibly wielding the language of DEI to initiate the broadest and most significant assault on civil rights and racial integration in the country in more than a century. Is President Johnson with Dr. King, Whitney Young, and James Farmer in January 1964. Since returning to power, Donald Trump has used his singular authority as the head of the federal government to recast the white majority as the primary victims of systemic racial discrimination. This is what I'm talking about. This is what he's been doing. This is what he campaigned on. White grievance. This is what he campaigned on. Now, where are all the black people who said they were voting for Trump because they thought they were going to get stimulus checks? Because they thought he gave them stimulus checks in his first term because he put his signature on them, when actually it was Congress that did that and passed the stimulus checks, part of the coronavirus package. That came from Congress. Article 1, Section 9 of U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, power of the purse. The ability to tax and spend belongs to Congress. So you have black people saying, we want those stimmies again. Donald Trump didn't campaign on stimulus checks for black people. He did campaign on unleashing the police on your black ass, though. Everybody has a smartphone and we're dumber than ever. Since returning to power, Trump has used his singular authority as the head of the federal government to recast the white majority as the primary victims of systemic racial discrimination, though no evidence, not even self-reporting among white people, shows this to be true. Okay, read the rest of this here, because this is, like I said, this is a long essay, man. This is deep, okay? This is deep what's taking place. And this is what we were warning people about. So we have to continue to fight this, continue to educate ourselves. We have to leverage our economics to enforce our political agenda as well. We're going to have to engage in continue with economic boycotts against corporations, but also, as I've said on Roland Martin Unfiltered, go after some of the corporations that help to finance Republicans and put them in office as well. Go after the top 3 or 4 corporations and have nationwide economic boycotts against them. And also, we have to look at where our pension fund dollars are invested, because oftentimes we finance our own dehumanization through where our pension fund dollars are invested and our 401k dollars, because you can redirect where those dollars are invested as well. It's been done before. To give you one quick example, then we have to move on. Back in June, I think it was 2017, in New York City, the city employees in New York City, they withdrew $48 million in pension fund dollars from privatized prisons. They found out they were invested in privatized prisons. Okay. So we have to redistribute the pain through targeted, sustained economic withdrawal strategies and leverage our economics to enforce our political agenda. Okay, let's look at this article here quickly. Okay, the city has sold off about $48 million in stocks and bonds of 3 private prisons, according to the controller's office, after a unanimous vote from the fund's trustees. After a unanimous vote from the fund's trustees. The move comes after a scathing federal audit of private prison facilities last year, and after 8 immigrant detainees have died in the last fiscal year while in private immigration detention centers, which house 65% of immigration and custom enforcement detainees. So these private prison companies like Core Civic and Geo Group, they've gotten contracts from Trump, from the federal government, to house migrants, just like they were doing in his first administration, because the private prison companies have financially backed Trump because he supports private prisons. So if you are against private prisons, but you voted for Trump, you are a damn fool. If you are against private prisons and you voted for Trump, Trump is a big supporter of privatized prisons. The trustees of the city's pension funds voted in favor of divesting in a mid-May meeting, the stocks and bonds in 3 companies, Geo Group, Core Civic, and G4S, have since been sold, Stringer's office said. Okay. All right, read the rest of this piece here. Research this. New York pension fund to back out of investments in private prisons. There are other examples, but I don't have time.